We continue our study of the book of Exodus, and we are in Exodus 1, and we left off at verse 15. And I wanted to, before we get into the text once again, I wanted us to really consider at this point in Moses' life where he is. We left off on the fact that Moses tried to raise the Israelites up to throw off their Egyptian masters. And he was summarily rejected by his brethren because he had killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew. And then the thing got out. The thing was known from what we find in verse 14. Moses was afraid. Moses at this point was about 40 years old. He was in the prime of his manhood by any measuring stick. Stephen would later say in Acts chapter 7 when he preached to the Sanhedrin that Moses was mighty in words and in deeds. Moses, if you wanted to picture in your mind at this point what Moses possibly looked like, Charlton Heston is probably the best thing that you could consider. Heston portrayed Moses on the big screen, and of course Heston was a larger-than-life actor. But you consider how he portrayed him as a young man. And to me, that would sort of fit the bill. Moses had been educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He had been trained to be a pharaoh. He had been trained in the art of rhetoric, public speaking. He had been trained in horseback riding. He had been trained in all the philosophies and religion of Egypt. He had been trained as far as military strategy is concerned. In every way possible, Moses was being reared to be a leader. And couple that with Moses' physical abilities. By this point in Moses' life, Moses thought that he could lead a rebellion against Egypt. He knew who he was. He was an Israelite. He had been reared by his mother, after all, when he was young. And so he knew that he wanted to throw his lot in with his people. He thought at this point in his life that he could raise a rebellion of the Israelites against Egypt by the sheer force of his personality, by the sheer force of his leadership. He was a man of action at this point. He thought that he could do it. Do you see the problem? He thought he could do it. That was the issue. He was too self-centered at this point. And so when he kills the Egyptian, and then he tries to raise up this rebellion, he realizes the powers that be are not going to allow it. And that brings us to verse 15. It says, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. Now, Moses is a good writer, and he can say a lot in a few words. That's the mark of an outstanding writer, is if he can say a lot in just a few words. As Shakespeare would say, brevity is the soul of wit. Well, Moses believed in brevity. Look at this verse. He says, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. Now, that's not just Moses alone doing this. It's not just Moses trying to kill him by himself. Moses is utilizing everything at his disposal as the leader of the nation of Egypt to kill one man, Moses. If, as I believe, this Pharaoh is Thutmose III, Moses has got a problem. Because Thutmose III would later conduct many military campaigns into the Sinai Peninsula and into Canaan. He would be known by historians of the 19th century who would write about him as the Napoleon of Egypt because of all the military campaigns that he would launch. Almost as if he was looking for something or someone I believe in part he was trying to look for Moses to see if he could find him. If it also is the case that Tutmose was being motivated by jealousy, envy perhaps, then you've got that other factor entering in. Tutmose had been looking for his opportunity, apparently, to do something to Moses because Moses had been taking his place in the eyes of his stepmother, Hatshepsut. Remember her, Hatshepsut? By this point, she had been long gone because she had been killed under very mysterious circumstances. Most likely, Tutmose had her killed to get her out of the way, because he resented her doting and her attention on Moses. So if all of that is the case, then you've got all this motivation that Tutmose has already to kill Moses, to get him out of the way. He sees him as a threat, rightly so, and now he has his opportunity. He knows that Moses has killed an Egyptian, and now he thinks he can capitalize on it. So, Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh. Where does he go? He goes in the land of Midian. Where's the land of Midian? The Sinai Peninsula. Where is he going particularly? Most likely in the southern region of the Sinai Peninsula. That is where Mount Sinai has traditionally been located. There are other possibilities that have been raised by some scholars, but most believe that the Mount Sinai that has been identified traditionally as the Mount Sinai of the book of Exodus is indeed the right one. If that is the case, that's where Moses ends up. He's in the southern part, the southern tip of Sinai. And it says, he sat down by a well. Now, is this providential? Probably so. You look at what Stephen says in Acts 7:29. At this remark, that is, when the man says, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian. Moses had never been out of the land of Egypt in his life. Yes, sir. Yes. Very good point. The providence of God is at work still, even though Moses doesn't realize it at this point. Moses has never been out of Egypt before. He knows about the land of his people, Canaan. He knows about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. He knows about all these stories that has been taught to him by his mother. He knows about the Israelites, but he's never, as far as we know now, that's as far as we know, he's never been out of Egypt. Now, could it be that in his 40 years of upbringing, that in the process of his education and training, that he led military campaigns into Sinai? Possibility. We don't know for sure. We have to simply say, as far as the text indicates, he's never been out of Egypt. He is in a place that he has no knowledge about. Possibly. Could it be that he knew about this area in his travels? It's a possibility as well. Moses doesn't say. All we can do is just simply speculate. For whatever reason, he ends up here at a well in Midian. Verse 16 then says, Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to rule their father, he said, Why have you come back so soon today? So they said, An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock. Now you think about this for a minute. Moses is by himself. Shepherds, plural, more than at least 2, possibly more, come in. And what does Moses do by himself? He drives away those shepherds. And he helps the women water their flock. That indicates to me Moses is a pretty stout fella. And that's an understatement. Moses can handle himself in a fight. And that's apparently what took place. He impresses these women, and they say he's an Egyptian. Now, why do they say he's an Egyptian? Two possibilities. It could be that he was speaking the Egyptian language, or most likely is because of his clothing. Most likely the way he was dressed identified him, to them at least, as an Egyptian. He said to his daughters, verse 20, "Where is he then? Why is it that you have left the man behind? Invite him to have something to eat." Invite him in. We need to be hospitable to this man. He's done this kind deed for you. Where is he? Verse 21, Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Now, this is summarizing these 3 verses that Moses writes, summarizes a lot of things that are going on. So, he's willing to dwell with the man, number 1. The man gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. That took some time. Moses doesn't say how long, but it took some time. Number 3, verse 22, then she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So you've got a space of time that's summarized in 3 verses by Moses. Again, brevity is the soul of wit. You know, he is very concise in the way he describes things. That name Zipporah, by the way, means bird. So that indicates possibly that Zipporah stood out among his daughters in her beauty and the way that she conducted herself. For whatever reason, Moses chooses Zipporah to be his wife. So, verse 23. Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died. And the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. Once again, Moses summarizes a lot of period of time in 1 verse. He says, in the course of those many days. How many days? 40 years. 40 years is summarized by Moses here. Remember, Moses is about 40 years old when he flees from the land of Egypt. And he stays in Midian until the Pharaoh passes away. If this Pharaoh, as we have said, is Tutmose III, then that falls right in line with how long he reigned over Egypt. So in the space of 40 years, Moses stays there in Midian, and he's a shepherd. Now, what must that have done to Moses' psyche? What must have that done to Moses' mind as far as what he thought of himself in his place? Well, we're going to have sort of an insight in that when we get into chapter 3. Moses thought when he was 40 years old that he was ready to lead his people out of Egypt. He wasn't. He had to be taught more before he could adequately be the leader that God wanted. He just didn't realize it at this point. So, we go back over to what Stephen says in Acts chapter 7, and in verse 30 he says, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him. So Stephen makes divine commentary or inspired commentary on the text of Exodus, and he says 40 years has passed. So when we come to this point, you've got a whole generation that has passed on, and another generation that is raised up among the Israelites. And by the way, Pharaoh's dead. The one that looked for Moses and tried to have him killed, he's gone. And God, by the way, is going to tell Moses a little bit more information when we get into chapter 3 about that situation that exists in Egypt. So, it says the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out. So the oppression is even more intense. It doesn't let up when Pharaoh dies. When Tutmose III dies, you think that things would change? No, it only gets worse. It's only getting worse. And the cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So, God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. Now you think about this too. How many years has it been since there has been a miracle performed by God at this point? At least 80. It's been at least 80 years since God has performed a miracle, as far as we know from the text. The text does not indicate he's performed any miracles from the time Moses was born until this point. So at least 80 years have passed since God has done anything miraculous. So that's another factor entering into all this. Moses is in Sinai thinking his day is past, possibly. In his mind, perhaps he's thinking, I tried, I failed, my time's come and gone. He doesn't know if he's ever going to be able to lead his people out of Egyptian captivity. Well, God's working. God took notice. God's planning. God has in mind something far better than what Moses could have ever even imagined. Before we get into chapter 3, do you have any questions or comments before we move into that? All right. Verse 1. Now, Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So Moses gives us a little more insight as to what he's been doing all this time. What has he been doing for 40 years? He's been pasturing the flock of Midian. Really? Yes, he's been shepherding. Would that contribute to him being a leader? You better believe it. Moses doesn't realize it at this point. But all these years that he spent being a shepherd, tending the flock, would that have any bearing on him being the leader of the nation of Israel? You better believe it would. He would learn many insights, learn many lessons from being a shepherd over the flock to being a shepherd or the shepherd over the flock of Israel. Yes?
Who was the daddy-in-law? A priest.
Yes.
40 years he was learning the better way.
Yes.
And he's down just about ready. He's got this thing in his mind.
Absolutely. He's from the priestly tribe anyway, the tribe of Levi. And now he has been with his father-in-law for 40 years. More insights as to how to serve. He's being trained. He was trained for 40 years to be a Pharaoh. Now he's being trained for 40 years to be a leader, a true leader. And now it comes that he's at the west side of the wilderness, and he's at Horeb. The name Horeb means waste. So wasteland, possibly, the idea here. But it's called the mountain of God. The mountain of God, where God dwelled, where God resided. That's where he made himself known, as it were. Again, I refer to the movie, The Ten Commandments, and the way they depicted Mount Sinai with the clouds and the thunder rumbling, constantly. Perhaps that was the presence of God at this point. We're not told by Moses. All we're told is the mountain of God. Then verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. The angel of the Lord. Okay? the angel of the Lord as is described by Moses, but as the angel of the Lord is communicating with Moses, we're going to see that he refers to himself as I am. It's my conviction that this is the second person of the Godhead, the pre-existent Christ, because of what we're going to see described by Moses in the conversation that he has. Even if it is not the second person of the Godhead, is at the very least the angel of the Lord, as is described in other places. However, God is at least speaking through this individual that is there in that bush. Yes, sir.
That's the miracle. The bush is burning, but not consumed.
Yes. And that, Moses in 40 years had seen a lot of fires, I'm sure. He'd seen a lot of brush fires. He'd seen a lot of trees catch on fire because of lightning. He had seen a lot of things burn and then be obliterated. But here is a sight that he has never seen. This bush is burning, yet it's not being consumed. That catches his attention. Well, he wants to go see it. Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. Once again, remember, there has not been a miracle performed in at least 80 years. That is, if according to the text. What we're told, no miracle's been performed up to this point. And now, this is happening. Now, what Stephen adds in Acts 7:31 is this. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight. So it wasn't just he was interested. Stephen says he marveled. Well, I can't believe this. Never seen this before. So he goes up to it, verse 4. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him. Notice this. God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Now, let's look at this for a second. Pull back. The angel of the Lord has done this in this bush. And yet, Moses says, when the Lord saw, that word Lord in your translation likely is in capital letters. It's because it is the unpronounceable name of God. We're going to talk more about that shortly. When the Lord saw that, he turned aside to look. God. Now that's a different Hebrew name for God. Lord is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. We're going to talk about that in a moment. God is Elohim. When Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh saw, Elohim called to him. What does that indicate? Maybe nothing. Likely, though, it's the persons of the Godhead at work. God called to him. God is speaking to him from the midst of the bush. Again, I believe it's the second person of the Godhead. But we can only speculate. So he says, Moses, Moses. Acts 9:4, remember what Saul was told. He said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Moses, Moses. Similar. And he said, Moses said, here I am. Here I am. I'm ready. He knows this is God. He doesn't know what God has in store for him. Excuse me. Then he said, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Remove your sandals. Well, of course he will do that. That's a mark of reverence. You're in the presence of God. You're in the presence of the Creator. Remove your sandals. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face. Acts 7:32 adds that he trembled. So Moses was shaking, visibly shaking, and he hides his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Okay. Moses, at this point, is fearful. He hides his face. God has revealed himself to him. Now, hold that thought. Matthew chapter 22. When Jesus is engaging with his enemies, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians. Do you remember what the Sadducees asked him on that occasion about the resurrection? They posed to him this very elaborate marital situation. And they say, in the resurrection, and you can hear the sneer in their voice when they say it, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be? For they all had married her. What Jesus does, he says, you are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, verse 31, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. What's he quoting there? Exodus 3. He's referring to the burning bush incident, where God says to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, what's the significance of that for us? What does Jesus do with that passage? He tells the Sadducees, number one, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? Wait a minute. Who is God speaking to in Exodus 3? He's speaking to Moses. And yet, what does Jesus say? God's speaking to you, Sadducees. Now, that's monumental for us as far as interpretation is concerned. You got some of our brethren that say that you can't use implication and inference in hermeneutics, in interpreting Scripture. That's what Jesus is doing in Matthew 22. Have you, Sadducees, not read what God said to you? Well, God's not speaking to the Sadducees directly in Exodus 3, but he is speaking to them by implication. We can use implication and inference in interpreting Scripture. Then he says, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. What is Jesus doing there? He's drawing the correct conclusion from what God clearly implies. I am. He didn't say I was. If he said I was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, that would mean that they don't exist anymore. But God says I am. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That means they are in existence somewhere. They're in existence in another plane, in paradise. So much can be drawn from that Jesus draws from here in Matthew 22. But not only that, you go over to Mark chapter 12. And in Mark 12:26, what Jesus says is this. But regarding the fact that the dead rise again, have you not read in the book of Moses? Notice Jesus says it's the book of Moses, that is, Moses wrote it. In the book of Moses, in the passage about the burning bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are greatly mistaken. Jesus gives us principles of interpretation based right here in Exodus 3 that we can use today. Implication, inference, drawing correct conclusions from the text. We can do that. Yes, sir. That's right. When this life is over, that's not the end of it. There is life after this life is over with. Yes. That applies to the Sadducees of Jesus' day, and it applies to the modern day Sadducees today in the church and in religion that deny the resurrection. The resurrection is true because Jesus said it was through this passage. So I just wanted to take some time to focus on that to make sure we get the point that Jesus makes off of the passage that we're studying. What God is doing, he's not engaging Moses in a discussion about the resurrection. That's not what God's doing. But it has implication about that Jesus draws correctly from. So, verse 7. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters. For I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians. Now, he says, I have come down. Does that literally mean that God has literally come down to earth? No. That's an anthropomorphism. That is attributing human characteristics to God. I have come down. And he says, I know. I've seen it. I'm aware of it. And I'm going to do something about it. That's the point. Then he says, to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. God is telling Moses, I'm fully aware of the situation. I'm in control. We're going to take care of this. And you're going to be a part of it. Again, remember, at this point, Moses is 80. 80 years old. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it was something mentioned in Genesis also. There's two things happening at the same time. You mentioned in all the Canaanites. It says when the iniquity of the Amorites full. You see, so something is happening here with all of these Amorites. So at this time, this is getting ready to happen.
All of the tribes of Canaan have gotten to the point where something has to be done. Not just the Israelites are groaning under the oppression of Egypt, but the iniquity of the Amorites has reached its tipping point. And they're ready, or God is ready to deliver the Israelites into that land. So Moses is 80 years old. He had thought that his best days were behind him. He thought that his day had come and gone. But oh no, watch this. Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. Don't you know that must have been a shocker to Moses at this point? Here I've been 40 years shepherding the flock, and all of a sudden God appears to me out of a bush and he says, come now, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. Moses objects. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? Who am I? Inadequacy. That was his first objection. Moses thought he was the man at 40. He was rejected summarily, had to flee for his life. He thinks that's it for me. And now God's saying, you're the one. After 40 years of pasturing, tending the flock. Me? Me? But you know what? That kind of trait is the mark of a very good leader, quite often. When a man in himself thinks, I don't know if I measure up, that's good, because he's not full of himself. Moses, at this point in his life, was not full of himself. He had been brought down to humility because of his station. And now he's being presented with this opportunity. Moses doesn't just jump at it and say, let's go. No. Who am I? Who am I? And he said, certainly I will be with you. There's the factor. Moses has been missing the point. He missed the point for the first 40 years of his life. He hasn't seen it up to this point. God says, I will be with you. And this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. So God says, it's a done deal. When you have brought the people of God out of Egypt, not if. Notice that. When you have brought the people of God out of Egypt. You know, God speaks of things as it's certain. It hasn't even happened. He says it's certain. That's one reason why in Daniel chapter 2, when he's talking about the kingdom that shall be established, that will destroy all these other kingdoms, God says through the prophet, it, the kingdom, shall stand forever. Forever. All this doom and gloom talk about the church dying, the church being obliterated off the face of the earth, that's going to just wither up and die, I don't believe it for a second. The church will not die. The Lord's church will remain forever. That is, until the Lord comes again. Nothing that man can do can destroy the church. Nothing that man can do can obliterate it. When God says something that's a surety, take it to the bank. And that's what God tells Moses. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, it's coming. You're going to do it. Verse 13. Then Moses said to God, behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? All the gods of Egypt, the gods and goddesses of Egypt, had names attached. Every one of them. Every one of them. In the pantheon of gods. And Moses doesn't know the name of God. Now we think that's strange because, of course, is God, Lord. But Hebrew language is what we're dealing with here. What is his name? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. I am who I am. Now that brings us once again to the name of God, the unpronounceable name of God according to the Hebrews. Why is it called the unpronounceable name of God? Because in the Hebrew tongue, this name for God that you have capitalized as Lord in your translation is 4 Hebrew letters. Yod, He, Vav, He. All consonants. No vowels. Yod, He, Vav, He. How do you pronounce that? Nobody knows. Nobody knows how to pronounce that. Yod, He, Vav, He. So what have they done? In the Greek Septuagint, they take that name, Yod, He, Vav, He, and they change it over to Lord in the Greek text. Well, is that connected with Yod, He, Vav, He? Not really. That's about the best they can do. So what do the Hebrews do with Yod, He, Vav, He? They don't pronounce it. They don't write it. For a long time they don't. Because it's the unpronounceable name of God. They thought that there would be a curse pronounced upon you if you tried to pronounce it. What God says about it here gives us meaning. I am who I am. I am has sent me to you. Now what translations do with that Yod, He, Vav, He is they add in the translation vowels to it. So it becomes Yahweh, Yahweh, or Jehovah. That's where Jehovah comes from. Trying to work with that unpronounceable name of God, the best way to get it across to our way of translation. Yod, He, Vav, He. I am who I am. Interestingly, Clyde Woods has this to say. I'm not going to read the whole thing that he says, but he has some insight about this I think that would be well for us to consider. He says, concerning this divine name, this is my name forever, verse 15 says. The present passage evidently gives the meaning of this divine name. So this name is, I will be what I will be. I am what I am, coming from a form of the word to be. God says, I exist. I'm here. And that's all you need to know. I am has sent me to you. Further, verse 15, God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, there's that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, the Elohim of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name, I am that I am, forever. And this is my memorial name to all generations. That name continues to be the name of God. I am that I am. Unfathomable. Unfathomable. Yes, sir.
This will be secret too, because when he goes back, they're going to want to know what is the name, and they're familiar with all the names of the Egyptians. And when he pulls this out of his bag and says, I am, said me, bang, they know that he is one of them.
He is different from Egypt. He is different from the Egyptian pantheon. He is above all. He has always been. He always will be. He exists. He transcends everything that man could ever think about him. That should open up our minds to the transcendence of God, to the majesty and the awesome power and the awesome spectacle of the God that we serve. I am that I am. None of us can say that about ourselves. No one can say that about themselves. No one has ever been able to say that. Only God in heaven can say, I am that I am. That's tremendous. This is where we'll leave off our study. We'll take up